Good afternoon to everyone.
Good afternoon.
Yes, sorry for the bit of delay. We shall be starting in a bit. You're very welcome for all those that are attending and for our speakers for the day. I can see we have Dr. Olive Kobusinje online, Dr. Ekwaro Buku, Bwesije Wamwesije is also with us, and I know that Dr. Spire will be joining us also very shortly. So you'll bear with us just a little bit, a few minutes, as Dr. Spire also gets online. But to say that also Alana Kembabazi will be getting online shortly. But also to say that this discussion will be live streamed on the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights Facebook page, as well as the YouTube channel. Yeah, just that, and we shall be starting in a few minutes. Thank you, everyone who is here on time. And again, we shall be starting in a bit. Yes. Thank you very much for bearing with us on that. And we can now start. We have all the panelists on. Dr. Spire, you're very welcome, and Miss Alana Kembabazi. And to start us off is just to let us know that so this webinar will be happening for 2 hours. And what we shall do is that we shall have Dr. Spire taking the lead to give us a snippet of what the book is about, so that we get a sense of what it is exactly we shall be reacting to when the time comes. And then I'll be expecting all the speakers to have 15 minutes presentations also in reaction to what Dr. Spire shall have read and narrated to us about his ordeal in quarantine. But then also to generally answer the questions as I'll be posing. I'll be your moderator today, and my name again is Chira Brian Alex. And yes, to start us off, the audience that is with us, you'll also be having a time of interaction. We've reserved about 30 minutes for that to happen, so that you can get to ask your questions. And as I go ahead, the speakers go ahead, feel free to pose your questions in the chat. We shall be seeing them, and they will be responded to in time. Without much further ado, I will invite Dr. Spire to give a few remarks about this, but also to highlight for us his experience, so that we know, in summary, what this book is about, what the memoir is really about. So, Dr. Spire, if you may. As Dr. Spire still sets up, I hope he can hear us. Also, to let us know that prior to this launch, we had a press conference before, and so this is following up on that. Video.
Hello. I'm hearing that there's double feedback, and I think.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to have you for this launch of my book, Quarantine, My Ordeal in Uganda's COVID-19 Isolation Centers. Yeah, just briefly to talk about the book. It's basically an account of what we went through in quarantine, although it's written as a memoir, like it's my experience, but it basically tells about so many things that people went through, those that were quarantined with, and others that shared their experiences with me while I was in quarantine, those that felt that my voice could sound out what they were going through. Why would I have to write this book? I know that so many things go up around, that so many things happen in this country and they pass just like that. So I documented these experiences as a way of, first of all, having an account of what happened. Second, that we can learn from these experiences, we can learn from what went wrong, especially in order to improve or in order to perform better in case we are to experience something like this on another occasion. Much of what this book tells are the things that we wouldn't have expected to happen in the first place. Maybe a little bit of context for those that may not have heard the earlier stories, although I would imagine that many of you did. We were among the first group of Ugandans to be quarantined, to be put under mandatory quarantining by the government of Uganda. But this happened when we are already midway. That's when the guidelines were passed. So we get to know that we are going under mandatory quarantining on arrival at Entebbe. And I think that's basically what makes our quarantining problematic, that we are not aware, and you would expect that a group that was not aware is treated in a certain way, mindful of the fact that they might not have been prepared in so many ways. Guidelines themselves or the policy wouldn't have been passed because a lot of things were happening in a rush, so many things were not really prepared for. But the idea is that, the key idea, that some of the basics of quarantining we are expected to have known. Second, we, unlike other countries, many other countries had gotten the benefit of time, that we had about 3 months to prepare. The pandemic had already started in other countries and we're hearing everything that was happening. But for it to happen, to arrive here, for the virus, for coronavirus to become a concern in Uganda, and we are caught almost flat-footed when it comes to quarantining, that even the very first quarantine center that was ours did not even meet the basics. But all you had at Central Inn, where we were quarantined in the first few days, was a bottle of sanitizer standing at the door of the hotel. Beyond that, government's presence was showed by the soldiers, by the police that were at the gate. So it was more of a concentration camp that we had been dumped into. The idea was that government was protecting society. But as you protect society, do you think about the well-being of the people that you had to put under lock, that you had to put under isolation? Because I think even our own well-being would have mattered, but it did not seem to be anywhere within the picture of government plans. You didn't expect that people that got to know about such guidelines along the way, that they really knew or they had the means, they were prepared, they would pay for the hotels. At first it was $100, then later it was reduced to 60. When we arrived, we are told it's a discount, and then later to 55. And everything had an indication that there was some sort of a strategy or an ill plan, some sinister motive by some people to profiteer from the entire exercise of quarantining. So many of these things are what I document here. I document what happened at arrival, what happened in quarantine, what happened when we meet the minister, what happened in the 24 days that I spent in quarantine, what was happening at other centers that was shared with us, how were we released, and at some points, the recommendations, what we would have done better, what we can do. This book is funded by ISA, the publication, and they have a chapter in here that gives, that contextualizes the entire story in terms of human rights, in terms of things that would have been in place for our rights to be better respected, or the entire thing to be managed. And they give some solid recommendations. So it's not just a story that narrates an ordeal, it's also a learning point. It's something from which we can reflect on how we can do better. Oh, it's not an entirely sad story. There is so much humor that you will find here. There are so many interesting episodes about things that we may not have mentioned while we're in quarantine that happened. Some funny, not really funny stories that unfortunately, even cases of sexual harassment, cases of escape we talked about, but the nitty-gritty is the detail of how the escape plans were laid, how they were strategized, and how some people managed to jump out of the terrible centers. Initially, I actually was blaming some people that were escaping, but ultimately seeing what we went through in the 24 days, I think it wasn't entirely a wrong idea for one to escape. But what this means to the wider society was that we were put at risk. If it had been better managed, many of these things perhaps wouldn't have happened. Yeah, so that's briefly what this book is about. But there is much more that you'll find within the text itself that I cannot summarize in a few minutes. Thank you. Maybe to give us a glimpse of the content of the book, I read a short excerpt, and this is about our arrival when we get to Central Inn. I read just a small section. This is chapter 3 of the book. Entebbe town, located on the shores of Lake Victoria, is a quiet town. In this dead of the night, it felt like we were driving through a cemetery. When we were not talking, all you heard was the sound of the drizzle on the car windows. I'm not very familiar with the town. Even if I was, my load of anxiety at the moment would not let me follow the direction of our tense journey. It took us about 15 minutes to get to a dimly lit gate off the main road. The van stopped and its inside lights were turned on. From my corridor seat on the row behind the driver, I heard a firm, deep voice come from behind by the doorway. A medium-sized man whom we had traveled with from the airport had stood up to welcome us to Central Inn. He had been quiet the entire drive from the airport. I cannot recall the exact words he used, but remember the disquieting message, and I quote, "You are all welcome. I'm the manager of Central Inn. You may have been told that you're supposed to pay $100, but we have now decided to give you a fair rate of $60 for bed and breakfast." What had seemed to be an ugly joke was taking the shape of dreadful reality. The manager appeared to have expected us to appreciate the discount. While he spoke, his eyes scanned our faces, perhaps in search for a nod, as if we had just arrived for a tour. Instead, we interrupted his speech to ask, "What about those of us without money?" He had all the answers, shrewdly packaged in the favor of Central Inn. Hadn't the government donated us to the hotel anyway? "There are other options for those who can't afford," he said. One of the alternatives was a nearby hotel which he vaguely spoke about while pointing to one of the darkest corners of the night. The second was to take those who couldn't pay to Nakasongola Barracks. "We are also offering the lobby free of charge for those who can sleep there," he added. We were too tired to argue. Besides, there was no real choice. All right, I take it back to the panelists, but that's just a brief hint onto what we went through, but you'll find much more and many more funny yet very sad stories in there.
Yes, thank you very much, Spire. That was also a very, as you said, still interesting, but sadly so, story. And I was able to get the quote where he said, after all, hadn't the government donated us to the hotels in a time where most of us, again, were looking to the government for solutions. It is sad that out there we had a group of people that were firsthand bearing the brunt of having not been attended to in one way. The pandemic found them in the middle of nowhere, and at this point they thought that they would find solutions, or at least an amiable welcome when they got back home. But that notwithstanding, I would still love at this point to get to our next speaker. And before we really get into some of the nitty-gritties on how this can be viewed in perspectives such as health governance, because again, we have some health policy experts as some of our, panelists today. I would like to weigh in, and this is for one of the people that have traveled this journey much more intimately with Spire and for a longer period, by way of trying to package this story in a way that is provoking. Bwesije, and that is from Ubuntu Reading Group, was one of, or is one of the publishers of this text, and I would love to hear from him. I don't know if Bwesije is still with us. I think we've lost Bwesije. And in that event, I will just move on to one of the other panelists who can come and weigh in. I will start with Dr. Kobusinje. Yes, Dr. Kobusinje is still with us. Dr. Kobusinje, one of the things that we've noted, and even as the pandemic was starting to unfold, to unravel, it was that when Ugandans started decrying the state of things, some of the comments that were commonplace were that this was unprecedented. It wasn't seen, so very many people didn't have solutions, and just not for Uganda, world over. And so the question would be that, and again, as you react to bits of what Spire just said, but also bearing knowledge of the contents of this memoir, do you think there is much that could have been done differently in the circumstances? Because it really appears that everyone was, groping in the dark. There wasn't anything specific that people would have pointed to. So if you can just weigh in again, reacting to what Aspire has to say, but also for the question of could much have been done differently?
Thank you very much, Brian. And congratulations, Spire, on publishing this book. Maybe before I speak about what could have been done differently, or whether what happened was really the way it should have been, just to say that this is a book very much worth reading. It's very fast-paced. You first encounter Spire in Cambridge as he's literally fleeing the UK, and he carries you on this journey, and he doesn't let you go until he eventually leaves quarantine. And all through the book, you encounter great humor and great humanity. And you see people and you meet people, you almost feel like you've met them and talked to them. And you see how they interface with our amazing healthcare system. But back to your question, so the pandemic was formally declared by WHO on the 11th of March, on the 11th of January, and so we had lots of preparatory time. We were we did not see our first case until I think the 22nd or 23rd of March. So we had plenty of time to prepare ourselves. Unfortunately, a health system is not something that you quickly slap together when you hear that there's a pandemic coming. It's stuff that you should have been doing. A healthcare system in Uganda should have been robust long before the pandemic showed up, at the airports or at our borders. So I think even given that we had 2 months, there were a lot of things had been going wrong, had been absent. We didn't have sufficient human resource. The human resource we had was poorly prepared, poorly motivated. We didn't have enough facilities. The infrastructure was falling apart. And all that is not things you fix in a hurry. But even so, I think given the 2 months, there is a lot that could have been done. And as Spire describes throughout the book, you see that some of it has to do with preparedness, even in terms of information. Like most of the time, they were really seeking information. They weren't necessarily saying, let us get out. They were seeking credible information that I think should have been available and availed to them as and when they needed it. There was clear injustice. Now, when you declare that people are going to be taken into a quarantine, when they are mid-air, at least be fair to those that already left their places of origin, and then start with those that know even as they embark. So I think justice is not something we can say, oh, we were being unjust because we had only 2 months to prepare. I think that was definitely could have been done better. But then stick to the science. I mean, health and health systems should run on science. So the very fact that they were taken to this center where there were actually no health workers, no provision for quarantine. Now, if it's going to be a quarantine, let it be a quarantine. Ensure that people are not mixing. At the very least, provide them with services, maybe to check their temperatures, maybe if somebody is unwell, to let somebody know that I'm unwell. It basically was just a center where all of these people were being herded, as cattle, and there's no excuse for that. So not only were we unprepared in terms of, it's not, one can envisage how many people are going to come through the airport. It doesn't just happen. People don't just show up at airports. There are schedules. And yet the facilities they prepared were clearly not adequate for the numbers that they were anticipating. So not only was there poor preparation, there was injustice, there was corruption, there was not thinking through the science. And yet these people really braved it with what humor they could, with what humanity they could, and so on. I think allow me to read for maybe just 30 seconds, and then I'll let this go. Just an example of why I think that we definitely could have done better. This is from Quarantine, from the book, and this is when the group meets the Minister of Health. The first time she meets them, they are distraught, they are in this place, they don't have the money. And then she says, so they begin to plead and they say, listen, we got onto the planes without knowing that there's going to be this quarantine. We don't have the money. And then she says, even if you move upside down, you only have 2 choices. Let's begin from there. You only have 2 choices. Either you exit the country or you stay here. If you're ready to listen to me, then you can listen. If you are ready to make noise, you will go back. Security will ensure that you go back. So I am not going to listen to people who think they are rowdy and you don't have authority over Uganda. You don't have authority over Uganda. Now, that is not the voice of somebody that's facing people that just got stranded out of no fault of theirs. And so that's why I think courtesy, courtesy is not something that we buy, something that we have and are. And I think that certainly this could have been done better. So I'll live with this saying. They say that when all you have is a hammer, every problem is a nail. And I think in Uganda we have guns. And so everything that we approach, every problem we want to put a gun. That's why you see so much security over a quarantine center that really should have had nurses and doctors instead of soldiers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olive. We also would the next time we're seeing you speak, we hope that you can be able to grace us with a picture of yourself so that we can see you. Could be the only chance we get to for some of us nearest to reality. But again, yes, thank you very much. There she is. Yes, so thank you very much, and for the insights that you've given us. I will still be getting around back to you, and also as people ask questions. But again, very key from what you've said is the need to have access to information on what is happening in situations such as this, because at a time of desperation, the least someone can ask for is, can I know what is going on, who is in charge, and what can you tell me, to allay the fears. It weighs down on a person very differently if they're in such a state and still they can't seem to know what is happening. But also, having noted that even prior, when the pandemic came, we had a couple of gaps in our health system, and talking about human resource and also infrastructure wise. So it seemed like at that time we were we're just peppering up the cracks, and then of course, as we know, most of those will not stay intact for so long. And ultimately everyone could see what was really going on in our system. I will now move on to our next speaker. As I said before, we have Dr. Obuku Ekwaro. He's also with us. He's the former Uganda Medical Association president, but he's also a health policy expert. And I would like to ask Dr. Ekwaro. I hope he's still online. Yes, he sure is. And as he works out his video too, as a health policy expert, what does Spire's experience for you most profoundly expose about our health system, but also governance broadly, health governance?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm not going to be on video so that I can have a clear
Connection.
Audio, yes. Sometimes it interrupts, and I found it better to always have audio. Thank you very much, by the way. I'm honored to be part of this very important activity. Of course, everybody knows Spire. We are following, we're all locked up at home and reading every newspaper and every article to pass time. And I managed also to catch up with Spire's stories before he wrote the book. And when he wrote the book, of course, it's an important experience to capture. I just wanted to just inform the panel that some of these have actually been documented in a scientific paper, but I don't think they're as in-depth as the book because of limitations of space. And I found the book very rich and really going into the experience, the lived experience. It's sort of a phenomenology, the lived experience of Spire, which really shared what was in it. My brother was also there, having been caught unawares. And this group, which was caught unawares, of course, were the guinea pigs where we learned a few things here and there. I wanted to recapture and echo what our teacher, Dr. Kobusinja, had said about, an ambushed quarantine. There were unforeseen costs. And as Spire said, there was escaping, attempts to escape. Pandemics, nobody prepares for pandemics. Even the health systems abroad were overwhelmed, probably more than we did. If you look at the USA, looking at the health system, the medical system, these guys have sent an object to the moon, and they are planning to send. We're investing a lot of money through the private sector, of course. to visit Mars, but they were running out. They had no ventilators, for example. They had no masks. They had to, at one point, capture masks which are destined for Germany. So the characteristic of pandemics is there is fear of the unknown, there is panic, there is anxiety, there is anger and depression. And even if we had prepared for 2 months, nobody knew how it was going to look like. And of course, right now we have the benefit of the doubt. When you look back and you read the Auditor General's report, that 4.1 trillion was spent in managing this pandemic, and over 70% of it was from loans. You sit down and ask yourself, why were the Spires spending money fit for 4-star hotels, for a 1-star hotel service for so long? Was this the most important population so that they could quarantine themselves? Even when they're quarantined, the truck drivers were being let free to come in. And, they were the ones who brought it in. But it was inevitable anyway for this pandemic to reach where it has reached. I wanted to turn attention of the discussion to the governance issues such as the laws, the policies in place. And you realize that we are relying on the Public Health Act of 1935, by the way, Chapter 281. I don't know whether it has been amended, but when I looked in there at that time, of course, I was trying to understand what's going on. You realize that Section 5, I think, or Part 5, gives almost absolute powers to the minister to come up with laws through, of course, an advisory committee. And this is what the president kept referring to as scientists. Now, there was very little science, which kept shifting. Should we put on a mask? Should we quarantine? But there are papers which have suggested that actually quarantine was, especially this community, this quarantine of, institutionalized, was detrimental to the mental health of many. And we did not provide for those services. We don't even have the capacity, by the way, to provide mass mental health care. The psychiatrists we have, for example, are a handful. They cannot, for example, be deployed to just the regional hospitals. The psychiatric clinical officers and nurses. So we are lacking, and the Ministry of Health and the government had to be very innovative. But certainly, in retrospect, that kind of quarantine was unwarranted. In retrospect, it was unwarranted, and that is a lesson learned, and that is the benefit of documenting what Dr. Spires documented. The details are really disturbing. When I hear of things like sexual harassment in that situation, when you are being coerced and cornered and forced to pay a fee, which ordinarily I have never paid for a hotel at $100, unless there is a sponsor, I'm going for a conference, or a well-planned holiday you have saved over months and years, maybe, So to be ambushed and told you must take care of yourself. Of course, at that time we had no tests and so on and so forth. But now the story is different, I think. With the tests now, people can fly. With a bit of treatment, people can fly. With the vaccine, people can fly, and that changes the story. But still, of course, it is a lesson learned, and probably one of the things we need to consider in this is to change this Public Health Act and those regulations, because it talks about malaria, it talks about yellow fever and things like that, things, even smallpox actually. So it's an old thing. But also you have to bear in mind that we don't exist in isolation. We are part of the international bodies like the WHO, to which we subscribe, and they sort of set the tone. For example, the International Health Regulations of 2005 were amended at about that time, when there was the first, SARS-CoV outbreak. It was a document which was dealing with smallpox and yellow fever of those days, I think, in line with our Public Health Act. And they amended it in 2005, just to ensure that they can control the cross-border transmission of disease. And that's where some of these things, we borrow them from, so that we are part of the the international public health practices. Keeping that aside, one of the key lessons we learn, of course, from this quarantine is that we've got to think of the health system as a whole and not only medicalize it. We have got to deal with the problem of corruption, which has penetrated society. Even when you are dying, even when you're disparate, they are still disturbing you for money. People are dishonest. They are conniving with hotels. This kind of thing is really affecting access to care. I think for me, those are my quick remarks when I read the bits of the book, and of course, in reference to the existing governance structures. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Doctor, and for mentioning some of the things you thought came through from a policy perspective, but also for what many Ugandans seem to disregard much of the time, and that is mental health. The impact of seeing someone in such conditions, and more so still tying it in with what Dr. Olive said, that these people were just being thrown into these premises. There is no health worker, so they were all to themselves and no one could attend to them. So thank you very much, and also talking about corruption and how it knows at the potential that our health system has, but now when it comes in, we see that a lot is really lost. And of course, the laws, it also goes without a saying that these also set the tone. If we do not have laws that are alive to the realities of the situation, then we also dealt a bad blow, I should say. Just to note still as the discussion goes on is that the chat room is open. I can see that some people are already posing questions. Some have been answered. I can see Spire has been trying to answer that, but if your question hasn't yet been answered, we shall still pose it to the panelists. Feel free to address it particularly, but also if you want it to go across, that is also fine. I will now turn to the next panelist, Ms. Alana Kembabazi. And a lot has been said, and also looking at the context that what we're discussing is something that happened at the start of this pandemic. And since then, many developments have happened. Government has tried to respond using different strategies, of course, but the question is, and has been noted much of the time, is that even if we're caught unawares, in quotes, that we were not ready, surely some lessons along the way should have been taken. So I just want to know, and again from a human rights based approach, that looking at the various response strategies that have since then been taken by the government, do you think that the approach has improved gradually? Do you think that we have learned along the way? Over to you, Alana.
Thank you, Brian. And I'm glad to see a number of panelists that I haven't seen in a while, like Dr. Olive and Dr. Caro. We've in the past talked about the state of healthcare. And I want to start off by reading some of the bits in the book that I thought were insightful. So on page 162, he writes, on the night of 4th April, in a fit of rage, I wrote through Facebook to Mr. Emmanuel Aineviona, the spokesperson of the Ministry of Health. It's even more saddening that you don't see your mistakes and how they harm innocent people. I'm already working on a book on our quarantine experience. I mean, all these dust settles, the world should hear about this approach to public health policy. Aineviona responded to this particular message. I really understand that the quarantine is undesirable. This pandemic did not give anyone notice. A book will contribute to knowledge. And I think this is what we're trying to get at right now. We are a year from the time the pandemic, Corona was declared, but when it was officially declared like a pandemic, like they use the words pandemic, it was about a year ago, from yesterday. And we are reflecting on how far we've come. And I think experiences, just as Dr. Spires, really are a point of reflection on what many of the panelists have talked about, the preparedness of our system, The fact that, like Dr. Olive Kosinjo said, you don't build a health, if you've ignored your public health system, basically crippled it, you don't expect it to suddenly function overnight, right? But also the fact that, like Dr. Ekwaro has noted, there was often a lack of empathy and a forgetting that these issues, these are rights issues that individuals are at face and that things are interconnected. And I think human rights gives us a really great point of inflection around these issues. In the first place, the first thing that came to mind with all of this was, why were they being sent to private hotels? Like, we knew that at that point, this is March, we know that anytime it's coming. I think I came in a week before him, and I witnessed the same haphazard response. I actually was like, don't you need to take my temperature? Are you sure I can go? I mean, there was just confusion, but this today is not about that story. I think that what we should have, the government knew this was happening. Why didn't we have, from the beginning, public, quarantine places, I guess, but also as part of the public health system, where they're health workers, where they're counselors, because like so many panelists, and as Dr. Spire himself pointed out, this is a horrifying, everyone is scared. You can imagine being in his position and being treated as a villain as you're terrified. Like, why didn't we have the public health system really rapidly backed up to do this? Where did this money go? Who was behind those hotels? And in this book, at some point, he asks, whose pockets were being lined by this? Because it was a lot of money. Dr. Ekwaro talked about the Office of the Auditor General report that came out yesterday. And there's a lot of money that was raised, right? Among citizens alone, I think we had, and I can pick up the figure, we put up about 11.6 billion in terms of just Ugandans, whether companies, whatever, rapidly getting up, right? And so there are real issues around accountability that have not been addressed, but there are also real issues around what extent we prioritize public health systems, to what extent the government has proper stewardship of systems. He talks about the fact that at some point, they're seeing hotel workers. They're not really communicating with health workers. It's only later on that they get someone who just checked their temperature. They start shouting a lot. At some point, there's a strike. Then the minister is coming in for a quick moment and then gone, and again, they're left with hotel proprietors who are saying, sorry. He even makes fun of one of them for acting like this was his moment to shine and he was going to be the boss, right? So to what extent are we seeing the ministry gradually let go of its stewardship role, particularly in the context of pandemic, where we should have seen this really consolidated? We, in the beginning, saw haphazard implementation, and we continue to see that today. Here you have directives that say everyone, they make these directives at the beginning, saying everyone must undergo mandatory quarantine when they come back. Then if you recall at the time, those who had connections or money did not get to have to undergo mandatory quarantine. They went to their homes, right? So you have that differential treatment already happening. We are seeing it today. This week they launched vaccines. They said health workers are going to start. Then we saw the ambassador of Belgium. We saw, I do not know, UN. Then we saw social media influencers getting vaccines. Health workers had not, you could not say health workers everywhere had received vaccines. So again, a lot of haphazard implementation. And the challenge with when there's a lot of haphazard implementation, when there's limited access to information and engagement of citizens, when you ignore public health systems, the people that ultimately get hurt are those without means, are the poor. In this book, he details how girls who did not have money to avoid these rooms are now sleeping in the common areas, very vulnerable to sexual harassment, both from hotel workers and from other travelers, right? Yet they're arguably under the custody of the state because they cannot leave. It is almost a place of detention. It's not a gazetted place of detention, but it kind of does become one. And again, we will begin to question these things. How do you detain someone against their will when it's not gazetted? And there are loads of issues with whether or not even our legal framework had been prepared to get to make sure that these things are not happening in the absence of a strong legal framework that would prevent abuse and people enriching themselves. These questions are questions we continue to see today. But going forward, because I do want to make sure we have enough time for people to reflect and to ask questions, I think we need to take stock and say, has anything truly changed? A year ago, like Inegona says here, they were grappling with the pandemic. They did not know, a book will help them learn. Have things changed? A year ago, we were running around and saying, oh my God, we need ambulances, as though we did not know Ugandans were dying every day without ambulances. Oh my goodness, we need the healthcare workers. They have no protective equipment. The healthcare workers, even this year, have been protesting over non-payment of allowances. The same healthcare workers that are supposed to be carrying taking care of all of us, carrying the brunt of the pandemic. The same limited access to information. When we've argued about vaccines or COVID-19 money accountability, we've said, come before citizens, explain things in detail. We saw that at the beginning, it did not happen. We saw that when Spire comes, with decisions that are made while he's in flight, he arrives and you're just being dictated to. And it becomes a very adversarial relationship. And when you question, you're considered anti-government. A year later, we are seeing this. When we question about things like vaccines or money, again, we are considered anti-government. There's a lot of suppression there, instead of the government proactively disclosing information. I think what is going to cost us in this COVID-19 fight is if we don't learn from the mistakes. Because when we ignore public health systems, when there's corruption, when there's no access to information, when there's no community engagement, public trust is eroded, and you need public trust. Public trust is so low right now that Ugandans are willing to believe that a minister did not really get vaccinated, and they are willing to believe that all of this is a ploy to get money. Yet world all over, we are being told that vaccines are the quickest way to recovery. But the state of affairs reflects the extent to which Ugandans feel, can we trust our government? Can we trust that they are going to give us information? Can we trust that they are working in our best interest? And instead of the government addressing this, it continues to have this adversary approach. Spire talks about the fact that when they began to protest, they were then they saw soldiers surrounding them. These are public health issues. They're also human rights issues. You don't militarize them. You allow engagement, you allow community participation, you provide information. You are going to need every single Ugandan in the fight against this pandemic. We are a country whose health systems cannot take it if it continues to worsen. But as long as we don't engage them, as long as there's haphazard implementation, a minister says this, others get to skip the system, she says this, she doesn't wear a mask, as long as we see these vacillating positions in implementation, Ugandans are going to continue to believe that COVID-19 is not real. It is going to cost us in this fight. So a year since the pandemic began, we are calling on government, learn from the lessons learned. In this book, Isa draws lessons from a policy perspective, looking at what we have seen in the health system, from a budgetary perspective, from a legal perspective, from an implementation perspective, things that we think they should be paying attention to. But these, again, are not new perspectives. I would challenge anyone on this call to say that the perspective raised by Dr. Kobsinjo, Dr. Okwaro, or Dr. Spire, or I knew things. They are not. They are things we have known. So why do we keep repeating the same mistakes? The pandemic was supposed to be a wake-up call. Rawls said that if you are designing a new world, a world where you do not know your position, what your position would be, you would design a fairer world for the worst placed. So if the minister and others, even in thinking about, had taken a bit of that thinking, if they had thought, if I was the one coming from abroad into a situation where I'm terrified, I also don't know, no one even knows how this disease is fully spread, would I want to be treated like this? If I was the one right now, if I was a market woman, or if I was a poor person in Uganda right now, would I want to use the healthcare system that is available for me? That should be the point of reflection. And that requires, beyond policy, beyond thinking through statistics and policy, it's also going to require us to have empathy. And I think that's why stories like this are important. They are beyond the statistics. They reflect the human cost. There are points of inflection, and we hope this is carried through very strongly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alana, for the passionate submission. I could hear years of advocacy around this in that submission, and I thank you very much. And truth, in hearing what you're saying, that beyond just looking at the statistics, we have to look at what the actual human impact is. And I think that is all that makes for good policies. If a policy or an intervention is not really positively working for the people, in whatever perspective you look at it, then I think it is as good as dead. And still, you also re-echo some of the issues that the previous speakers have talked about around, proactively disclosing information, that we need not wait for the government to be nudged to provide this, but also the importance of cultivating public trust that, of course, necessarily follows the issue of proactively, again, disclosing information. Thank you very much. I'll still be coming around to you. I just, as I was still going through the book, also I came across page 111 that has Spire's, during the protestations that most of the inmates were having. I found that Spire on day 18 wrote that, "Dear jailer, as a prisoner, I don't need food. I need freedom first." And for me, again, this quote also speaks to the fact that at no one point should someone be in a place where they have to choose one right over the other. So I really think that it is absurd that they were pushed to the wall in such an instance that they had to forego one. And as we all know, human rights are indivisible. We can never forget that. And so at this time, as we go ahead, I've been trying to connect to Bwesige, but unfortunately he's having connectivity issues, and we shall be having someone speaking in his stead. I don't know if Mirembe can be able to hear us and can come and speak in. I know that she's part of the audience, and
just confirm which Mirembe exactly before I enable.
Yes, Mirembe Susan. I seem to be seeing one Mirembe though. There's one who is registered as EM Mirembe.
So is it EM Mirembe that I should enable?
Yes, EM Mirembe.
All right.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Mirembe, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. The Ubuntu Reading Group is interested in how Ugandans are, building political movements and resisting, and that is why we were particularly interested in Jimmy's book. And I want to contextualize it a bit with history of colonial era resistance. The Malakishu is the most enduring record of the colonial era resistance to the abuse of science by imperialist oppression and exploitation of the early 20th century. The Malakishu distinguishes itself from other brands of shoes because it does not need to be polished. It is good to go as is compared to other shoe brands and types for which one needs to buy shoe polish, translated into Uganda as the medicine for shoes for them to shine. The Malaki shoe on its hand renders shoe polish or shoe medicine obsolete. It was originally worn by British soldiers in the Western Desert Campaign of World War II in Libya and Egypt, and is a form of desert boots. It is made of calfskin or suede, a type of leather with a napped finish, and it became popular in the mid-20th century. The shoe Dr. Jimmy Spire Ssentongo is wearing today is a Malaki shoe. Jimmy Spire Ssentongo and his fellow travelers, stuck in institutional COVID-19 quarantine on arrival in Uganda, were at the time not necessarily literally wearing Malaki shoes, but their response to the oppressive and exploitative quarantine decree built on a century-old foundation built by the Malaki movement. Like the Malaki, the Sentongos were labeled anti-science for questioning the oppressive and exploitative conditions of the state-ordered and militarized mandatory quarantine. Abamalachi, who are followers of Malaki, Malachites in English, became the de facto name for Malachi, Musaja Kakawa's independent religious movement, which was also known as the Society of One Almighty God. Three of the other founders of the movement were Mugema Kate, James Biriko, and Reuben Musoke. Malaki trained as a lay teacher of the Anglican Church Missionary Society before becoming the lead preacher in the Malaki movement. Malaki's major point of divergence from the native Anglican Church which was complicit in the British imperialist control of Uganda and other territories that were cobbled together into Uganda, was the requirement for 6 months catechismal classes before the baptism of converts into Christianity. Malaki advocated for the popular universal baptism for everyone who believed and confessed that Jesus is the resurrected Lord and Son of God. He argued that the requirements for the 6 months classes before baptism was not biblical. Malaki argued for a faithful interpretation of scripture and called most of the ideas pursued by the native Anglican Church under the European missionaries and colonial dictatorship abuse of Christianity. And he advocated for this to end this oppression and exploitation. While Malaki was the lead preacher of the movement and gave it his name, Mugema Kate was the original force behind the Malaki and was the Owesaza for Busiro County. At the same time, the Mutaka for the Nchima clan, the latter position which made him the richer father of the Kabaka. He occupied a unique position as the head of the Monkey clan, serving as the governor of Busiro, which gave him the duty to oversee the county with almost all towns and palaces of the Sekabakas of Uganda. He personally installed Chwatu, the infant Kabaka. In 1898, 5 years after he was commissioned as a lay reader by the Anglican Church Missionary Society, and to counter Apollo Kagwa's evangelical efforts, Mugema Kate sent a delegation of Baganda evangelists to Nkore. Mugema Kate convened meetings attended by some of the anti-Apollo Kagwa CMS converts in his house, where they discussed the main points of divergence from the CMS. They wrote several letters to the Diocesan Council, pointing out the ways the CMS and the British reliant Apollo Kagwa led the native Anglican Church diverged from the scripture. Besides requirements for baptism, the group of rebels also pointed out that the Bible forbade taking medicine for those with faith in God. Mugema Kate's rebellion was more than of a religious nature. As a holder of 2 coveted offices, he was one of the most prominent and powerful chiefs in Uganda. His rebellion was therefore primarily political. As the custodian of most of the royal tombs of Uganda, which are located in Busiro, the county he governed, Mugema Kate saw it as his duty to defend the indigenous political system against European imperialist domination. Apollo Kagwa, on the other hand, was the main agent of British imperialism who had worked with Lugard of the Imperial British East African Company to defeat Kabaka Mwanga II and replace him with his infant son, Chwa II, in essence, replacing Buganda in the hands of Apollo Kagwa himself and 2 other regents, directly reporting to the British imperialists. After taking over Uganda and their military, the British and their agents, led by Apollo Kagwa, exploited Shua II's edge to draft the Uganda agreement, and on signing, said Mugema Kate absented himself from the Luchiku in protest. He argued that the agreement took away the authority of the Kabaka and the independence of Uganda. The agreement is known as the Great Uganda Land Grab, under which the British allocated land to the colonial dictatorship, the church missions, and collaborating chiefs, taking away powers of clan leaders over the same land. Mugema Kate's anti-imperialist protest of the 1900 Uganda Agreement must be considered as central to the context of founding of the Bamalachi movement. At the height of the Bamalachi movement's growth in 1921, 7 prominent Baganda came together to form the National Federation of Bataka, the flood leaders, with a major objective of overturning the 1900 Uganda Agreement, especially the land grab, and return all the land ownership to the Kabaka for redistribution under the indigenous land tenure system. Of the 7, 3, including Mugema Kate, were indeed members of the Bamalachi movement. Mugema Kate's and Bataka Federation grievances included the fact that the Kabaka, Shua II, had come of age, yet the regents, including Apollo Kagwa, continued to run Uganda on the orders of British colonial dictatorship. The anti-imperialist outlook and the Bamalachi centrality to the struggle is usually glossed over, if not erased, in scholarship that sensationalizes the movement as an anti-doctor, anti-medicine, and anti-vaccine movement. It is important to primarily examine the Bamalachi resistance outside the summations of colonial power. Their primary resistance was against the loss of the right to self-determination as indigenous people. The colonial dictatorship's public health laws claimed to have a scientific basis and therefore depicted anti-imperialist resistors like the Bamalachi as unscientific in their defiance, thus claiming to control rinderpest. The colonial dictatorship made it so that quarantine of all animals was mandatory. The Bamalachi were suspicious of medicine and doctors as a response to colonial public health policies in Uganda and Busoga. The colonial dictatorship put immense pressure on the Kabaka to retire Mugema Kate from his position as the county chief of Busiro in response to the campaign against rinderpest quarantine. Earlier, the Kabaka had resisted the pressure, at one point intervening to grant permission to the Bamalachi to preach and practice a religious belief in all counties of Uganda. But this was overturned. True to form, neo-colonial states continue to mirror dictatorial tendencies of the colonial dictatorships that invented them. It comes as no surprise, therefore, that in 2020, the 34-year-old dictatorship of Yoweri Museveni responded to the COVID-19 global pandemic by mirroring approaches used by the British colonial dictatorship. When COVID-19 became a local problem, Museveni continued in the colonial dictatorial tradition of seeking to monopolize science and abuse it for purposes of controlling the indigenous people. Museveni decreed measures to control the spread of COVID-19 pandemic in Uganda, claiming that these were taking a scientific line, just like the British colonial governors before him. In the same ways of the Bamalachi in the 20th century that were labeled anti-science, those who approached the decreed COVID-19 response from a freedom-seeking perspective were labeled anti-science. Jimmy Spire Ssentongo and others, building on an existing public mistrust of Museveni's dictatorship, saw the COVID-19 response as an excuse to clamp down on freedom in the name of science. Using his training in logic as a PhD holder in philosophy, his skill and talent as a political cartoonist for a national weekly, and adept use of Facebook, Jimmy Spire Ssentongo exposed the excesses and the illogical and scientific basis and extent of the COVID-19 response decreed by the Museveni dictatorship primarily the compulsory quarantine required of people traveling from countries highly affected by COVID-19, which directly affected him. Publishing Jimmy Spire Ssentongo's memoir as he narrates his ordeal and the experiences of others that abruptly ended in the isolation centers is one way of challenging the abuse of science by colonial, neo-colonial, and neoliberal dictatorship. Oppression and dictatorship masquerade as scientific and natural in the same way capitalist bourgeois scholarships and myths claim that exploitation is natural. In publishing Jimmy Spire Ssentongo's memoir of resistance against the abuse of science to oppress, we are also honoring the Bamalachi resistance to imperialism at its height at the start of the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mirembe, for that insight of the Wamalaki and the shoes that Dr. Spire is putting on today and what that signifies. Thank you very much. I know at this time that we've gone through all the panelists, and I know that there were some questions that had already come through, but also most importantly, I saw one that came in for Dr. Ekwaro when he talked about policy and its significance. And one of the participants was saying that he knows that other countries have been able to do it in a better way. And if he can give some of the experiences that have been had elsewhere around how policy has been structured to respond to this in a better way. Dr. Ekwaro?
Yes, thank you very much. Again, you know, this is COVID. Nobody knew anything about it. America, the powerhouse, has recorded 500,000 deaths only recently. UK, you know, the whole of Europe. South Africa, which is supposed to be the most organized society in Africa, is having, I think, 50% of the deaths in Africa. So it's COVID really is a big problem. And Uganda, with all our problems, relatively, we are doing well if you consider the number of deaths as the outcome. This is the irony with the 4.1 trillion that was spent for the 40,000 cases and 330 something deaths. Probably we could have used our money more efficiently instead of buying pickups, you know, because if we wanted to implement community quarantine at that time, then we would have ensured that mothers have emergency care, for example, for cesarean section and other illnesses. We need to know how many passed away because of lockdown. We may never know that community quarantine. We needed to know, even in America, I understand people are dying in vehicles. They could not access hospitals because all the beds were full. So it's very difficult at this time without a thorough study to see what worked and what did not work, except that now we can point out the weaknesses and the strengths. But definitely Uganda has been hailed. It has been published in two reports I've seen that we are doing very well in terms of controlling the deaths, despite even the haphazard distribution of masks, the testing that was of course initially spread out and now it is targeted, the food that was limited. So for some reason, we are up there. So maybe there are lessons we can learn, but this is not the first time again. Remember, Uganda was hailed for conquering Ebola. You know, we managed to contain it. So there's something about our health system that when it comes to these epidemics, we are able to contain them despite these challenges. I mean, if you talk to people who are doing the Ebola work, they also complain they are not being paid. Some up to date. Crimea and Congo fever, I know in Nakaseke, they're not being paid. There were no gloves. For some reason, we were able to survive. But of course, the death toll in Ebola was very high. And maybe in Uganda, of course, we lost, I think, 15 health workers. And as Dr. Olive Kobusinja has pointed out, there are prayers going on at Sheraton to remember some of these health workers who died. Probably we could consider if they can be compensated, because that Workers' Compensation Act of, I think, 2,000 is there. 60 times your salary is what your family is supposed to get when you die in accordance to the law. So in terms of policy, yes, community quarantine was thought to work, but of course it has its limitations because the offshoot is that other existing diseases are ignored. And by the way, they kill more. If you look at malaria, the report of 2019-2020, the annual health sector performance report, 4,500 and something deaths from malaria alone. To date, documented COVID deaths are 304. Malaria budget, we were failing to get 360 billion to spray the whole country and cut out malaria. But we got 4.1 trillion for 304 deaths. Maybe it is because we got all that money that we prevented deaths. You know, you can never know until you do a thorough analysis to this. But seriously, yes.
I'm sorry, I want to understand this because you've been saying we're doing well. It's like you preface we're doing well. Tell us all the reasons where, like, that seems to be the official narrative. And then you rightfully point out the uncounted deaths, the uncounted costs, right? And so to what extent are we truly doing very well? Because like you said, we were known for being the best Ebola. Even now we are being praised for Corona, but are we truly doing well? From whose perspective are you truly doing well? And from what you're saying, healthcare workers, we're not doing well from a healthcare worker perspective. That is why even as we're memorializing them today, we're not having real conversations about how to protect our healthcare workers. Are we saying we're truly doing well? We had quarantines, we saw how these people were treated, and these were the elite. I mean, Dr. Spire is elite, you know, you're able to go abroad. How about those others who had no voice, right? So I want you to clarify whether or not we are truly doing well, because that statement confuses me. Well for who? From whose perspective?
And Doctor, I know that Dr. Olive also had an interjection there. I couldn't help but notice when you said that we don't know what it is, but there's something about us that we seem to be doing well with all these pandemics. We conquered Ebola. So I think she also has a comment, I think, before you can continue, that she can just chip in briefly and then you can respond all together.
Olive, you have to unmute yourself. You're muted right now.
I beg your pardon. Yeah, so there's such a thing as attribution. What do we attribute to the seemingly lower numbers of COVID-19 deaths that we're seeing in the country? First of all, let's distinguish between people that die of the virus and people that die as a result of the pandemic, whether it's the way we've responded to it or the way society has responded to it. So if we stick for a moment with those that are dying from the virus, let's just keep in mind that the jury is still out. Nobody can explain why we seem to be having fewer deaths, and for instance, why our hospitals are not completely filled with COVID-19 patients, even when it's well acknowledged that we are not using any of the public health interventions that have been recommended. If you just go out in the city and count how many people are wearing gloves, wearing masks, how many people are bothering to self-distance, how many people are bothering to wash their hands, so even whether they are hand washing facilities. People are sitting in taxis, people are sitting on borders, literally hugging each other and the border guy, no idea where any of them has been. So I think we would have to say that for whatever reason we are not seeing bodies in the streets of COVID-19 virus, we cannot say, oh, it's because Uganda has taken the necessary precautions, the necessary interventions. You would then have to name those interventions. And if you started naming them, I'm afraid they're not going to be many to name. But put that aside, let's just recall also that in Uganda, and I'm afraid maybe in other countries that took the same path, there are lots of deaths that have happened, that are continuing to happen, and that are going to happen in the future as a result of how we responded to the virus and to the pandemic threat. As you recall, in the early weeks of the pandemic and the lockdowns, the emergency medical service was in the hands of RDCs, RDCs had the power to allow you to get to hospital. They had the power over who got the ambulance and who didn't. Women were literally dying on their way to health centers. This is heartbreaking. So the health service, which should have been in the hands of people like yourselves, Dr. Eboku, healthcare professionals and public health specialists, was in the hands of soldiers with guns and politicians. And I think you know what happened as a result. Now, there's another whole story around malnutrition, about failure to access health services, even regular health services, people not being able to access hospitals. So the death toll that figure is yet to come in. So I think before we start celebrating how wonderfully well we are doing, we need to consider that people have died. And just because we haven't quantified it does not mean that it's not happening. So now, when we come to why we might be doing well, keep in mind that some countries like Germany, the USA, most of Europe, every year, lots of older people die of the flu. This is documented. They die of the flu. There is no pandemic. So this very aggressive, as they say, Senyiga, or what is the Uganda word, a very severe respiratory system disease, Senyiga umukambwe, is that anyone that had vulnerability that could be taken out by the flu was definitely going to go. And this is what happened. And a lot of other people that had comorbidities have also been taken by the virus. Now, if we have a predominantly young population, 70% of our population is below the age of 28, I think. Obviously, the comorbidities are going to be far fewer. And so that could explain why we have fewer deaths. Not because we have this wonderful healthcare system or Uganda has responded wonderfully. And I think we really need to temper our comments and I would like us to do well. I would like for no Ugandan to die of COVID. So I'm not saying this to say, oh, let's not celebrate because we want more deaths. No, we don't want any deaths, either from the virus or from mismanaging the healthcare system. All we are saying is, let's be careful when we talk about the toll, because we probably are not counting the right things. Thank you.
Yes, Doctor.
But I'm happy that my comments raised those concerns. I just want to clarify that, there is what is reported and they are my views. My views are very well known. I put them down on paper and they are what you are saying. But I wanted to recognize the fact that out there are two reports. I think one was a UN panel or something. And I've seen a more recent analysis out there in comparison to other countries. They're out. Yeah, the data. What they look at is, how many people have died, how many people have been detected, that kind of thing. So you have seen the New Vision carry back these stories home and, say we are doing well. So we need to recognize that as we dissect these issues, as we distill the issues, out there we are actually seen as a model country. With Ebola, I think there was no question about it. But with COVID, relative to the context of 4.1 trillion, relative to the context of the quarantine issues raised by Dr. Spire, relative to the context of the mothers who passed away because of community quarantine, relative to the fact that if we had our oxygen systems working anyway, if we had our blood transfusion systems working anyway, if we had our HDUs working, our national ambulance systems working anyway, would benefit much more than the COVID. Actually, for some of us, we thought that COVID was the Jesus Christ of the health sector because we thought now all the money is going to be released. It was released. We were expecting the president and this was the best time to announce, 100 ambulances to this place, 200 ventilators, and 1,000, 1,000 doctors or nurses or whatever trained. Instead, we saw, the police were being commissioned out. You remember I wrote that piece there. The president is prioritizing the security schools as opposed to the medical schools which were locked. But, after all is said and done, the final statistic which they submit to WHO and so on shows that we are relatively better off. But not to lose the point. lessons learned, we have evolved. It was inevitable that the cases were going to overwhelm the health system anyway, looking at data from other countries which even have more money, for example, the USA. And we evolved now to community quarantine. I don't think that there is any institutional quarantine facility at the moment because we've learned more about the disease. And this is really a post-mortem. That's one thing, that's what I wanted to mention. Thank you.
Yes, Doctor. Thank you, and also for the other panelists for chipping in, because at some point we really needed to know if what you are saying, and for all those that have glorified Uganda's efforts, if there is any directly linked, deliberate intervention that has been made by the government that we can give credit to. It doesn't seem that there is much to that end. I think from the submissions that we've had, but also to know that that in the rubble we've gotten deaths that may not directly be linked to the virus itself, but to the effects, as Dr. Kovusinya has also noted, and these of course go uncounted. Also, maybe Dr. Steele, because you are here, Dr. Buku, I think there's also a question around research that you'd I think released. Someone wanted to know if it is already at a in consumable state. Is it? I don't know what that question was. I think you talked about research before.
Yes, that paper I've already shared with the participant. It is a paper released by healthcare professionals on the of about I think there were 20 Ugandans who are quarantined. I'd like to say that Dr. Spire's book is really in-depth, more in-depth, because he released his lived experience, how he saw it from his eyes. This paper summarizes the experience of 20 people. And actually, I requested them to attend this meeting and maybe give, I don't know if they are here, but I saw it on Facebook and I know some of those colleagues. So I just asked them to join this meeting or at least get in touch with Spire and see if, they can compare notes. Because Spire's, of course, the book is more in-depth. It's a lived experience. Yeah, thank you.
Brian, I just want to interject before we leave, because I know we're going in a different direction now, because I do think the audience is, again, in this idea about whether we are doing well. I think there's also a discussion of who writes the narrative, who shapes the information that goes out there, and do we have credible information? As someone I think it's Damla who says we can't say this because of the government's response. Someone points out that conveniently after elections, the testing numbers have gone down. The amount of testing, can we see at a point right now, for example, that Uganda has done, we're rolling out vaccines. At minimum, we should have done targeted testing to get a sense. Do we have these other variants here? What is the percentage of the population? Was it that we got, corona and then we thrived with our lemon garlic concoction? The data that people can actually look at and believe. But some of the haphazard implementation, like for example, outsourcing testing the private sector with very little regulation, making it unaffordable for the majority of Ugandans. So you get your cough, you say, today I'm going to steam and pray to God, right? So we will never know if you died. Have you died because of hypertension or because of? We will never know because testing is only affordable to a few. So there's a lot of comments that I don't want us to ignore on that chart, and it's particularly around testing. Anna, for example, says how many are going for testing? The statistics drop down before elections. Simon says, for us to categorically come up and say we're doing well, we should not limit the conversation to the COVID-19 deaths. This is something that what Dr. Kovusinya was saying. We've had far more reaching consequences. Someone says, aren't we just surviving by the mercy of God? Can we truly say that? Aren't we mixing up attribution and credit of credit? Even sheer luck might be credited. And this is not to undermine what government has done. It is to say that at this point, the minister, for example, has geared up and said, be mindful, there's a second wave coming. At this point, we're also dealing with vaccination and variants, and the pandemic is changing shape. We should have strong lessons that we see reflected, right? We should make sure Spire's experience where this haphazard implementation, where only a few get certain treatment and others don't, where if you don't have means, you're left on your own in this pandemic. We should make sure that these mistakes are not being repeated. And unfortunately, we're not getting that very clearly. And so when we keep saying we are doing well, I think part of what we do is to say, okay, perspectives on the ground. The international community may think we're doing well. What do Ugandans think? Because their trust, their perception of how we are doing, their trust in the government is very critical in the COVID-19 fight, and it's at an all-time low right now.
Yeah, may I say something to that, just to, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair, may I go?
Please, doctor, that's totally fine.
Yeah, two things. One, from the data again, and even from interrogating owners of private hospitals, COVID has gone down. And no one can hold that for certainty and say this because of masks, because we know, obviously, the issue around masks is another story. And Dr. Kobusinja has put it rightly. It's another book, just talking about masks. They didn't reach where they were supposed to reach. Maybe it's the lockdown, the community quarantine. But if you look at Chikubo, those guys, they have been busy. So there could be other reasons explaining this. Now, are we going to have an experience as that of Dr. Spire Ssentongo? Probably not, because there are lessons learned. With the advent of testing, then the quarantine business is no longer warranted. Because you are...
Sorry, Dr. Obuku, for you, is the testing affordable to you? Let's say an experience of Dr. Spire where he's talking about, he comes in and they have to figure out, can you afford this hotel or can you not? That is part of his experience, right? The differential treatment based on what is in your pocket. So if it's affordable to you, is it affordable to the average Ugandan? Can they go for testing to avoid quarantine? But I'm going to shut up because I'm dominating this discussion.
No, that's important. What you're raising is very important. Equity, the issue of equity, leave no one behind. Of course, it was very unfair to the Spires who are ill prepared to force them to dig into their pockets and force them to go to a hotel and meet that cost. When data from other countries showed that anyway, the epidemic is coming, whether you contain these guys in a hotel or you let them go home, we better think of more sustainable. It was not a sustainable approach. It was in many ways a corrupt approach to enrich those guys with whom they had deals with. It was long overdue to let these people go and self-quarantine at home, because anyway, when it became a community problem, everyone was on his own. You remember that statement coming from government, that you are on your own. We have advised you. If you get it, then you need to just quarantine yourself at home. But let me bring the aspect of testing relative to what is happening, the travel now. Testing, of course, has come down all the way from, I think, $100. Did they say $65? Now testing is quite low with the coming of the RDTs, which can be done rapidly in some labs. It's still, of course, it's relatively low again, not low. It's 35,000, I think I've seen, or something like that in some places. The rapid diagnostic test. That's what it's supposed to be. If they're charging more, then it's not supposed to go that high. But the statistic we need to pay attention to, which corroborates this, the good testing practice, is the positivity rate. It has moved from more than 5%, meaning that for every 100 we test, we are getting so many cases, to now a lower positivity rate of less than 2%, suggesting that actually we are testing the correct population. And I think the guidance has changed, probably unofficially, that we are testing those who are symptomatic and report. So we are no longer doing the community testing where we test anybody and everybody. We are testing the symptomatic, where we are actually supposed to get a higher positivity rate, but we are getting it at less than 2%, which suggests we are okay. The testing is now okay. We can talk about the cost and access to it, and the testing actually suggests that we're testing the appropriate population. I'm seeing someone saying community testing never happened. It was never necessary anyway to go to that extent. I think it ought to have been targeted, because anyway, even when we tested, our hospitals were overwhelmed. our hospital, and the issue of quarantining at home and finding your own, it was not practical for many homes. I'm not talking about the Kampala homes in Bogolobi and Kira here. For many homes, if you just go and do a survey in Namuongo there and understand the bulk of the population where they live, you would realize that three people are sleeping in one room, and many people have one-roomed houses. So even if you say that we are testing you and if you're positive, you go and self-isolate where? Outside the house. So I think it's something we need to think about more carefully and probably be more innovative. Maybe we're going to have community quarantine centers. I don't know. That's subject to debate. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Buku. But also, just again to kind of bounce off from what you had said, I noticed that somewhere in your submission you talked about the government facilities being overwhelmed, and government, of course, ultimately had to engage the services of extra hands in the sense of private health facilities and whatnot. I don't know if Dr. Olive has something to say about that, because I know that it has become commonplace that the private sector is being gradually really incorporated in whatever intervention there is. I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of the day, even for the vaccination, would have it all over private facilities. And also to talk about the issue of cost, I know that there are also really very many variances around that, to say that facility X is charging this much, and at least the indicative figure that we've gotten from Dr. Oboku is that he has heard of those that are charging 35,000. And again, it's good that you said it's relative. It's really relative. But again, just to go back to Dr. Olive, what she thinks, is there really so much potential in having the private being involved? I'll soon be opening up again this discussion to the broader audience so that we can get some of those views that can only be voiced.
Thank you. Thank you. So something has happened very gradually, and it is not by chance. So government has this thing they call government public-private partnership, and it sounds wonderful. It sounds like, yeah, we engage with the private sector. The private sector has a lot of strengths that we need to bring on board, and the narrative sounds wonderful. In reality, what has happened is that it has allowed government to step away from its responsibility and let the market forces take over. And in some instances, not only does it do that, but it actually takes public funds from the public purse and it puts them into private facilities or private ventures and calls that a public-private partnership. But in the end, it actually hurts people who pay taxes. And I think that this is not just within the health sector, it's in many other sectors. So when you hear that, oh, we are also allowing the private sector or private companies or private hospitals in this case to take, to do some of the work, it means that they are actually making it inaccessible to those citizens who pay taxes, but who are not able to afford the higher costs that are pertaining in those private facilities. So all this that we are discussing here is completely irrelevant to the average person down there who earns 10,000 a day and has to feed a family. And this is what has happened. So at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this sense that, oh, COVID-19 is an equalizer. It has affected the wealthy countries and the poor countries. It has affected the rich people and the poor people. And it doesn't matter if you own a Mercedes, you still are going to stay home. That only lasted, I think, a couple of weeks. And then we started to see the rift between the rich and the poor get wider and wider, which is why you saw then people that were really needed beans and posho, barely getting them. And then you saw these other people that were being allowed to go to the posh supermarkets because those could self-distance and they had the sanitizer and everything. And from that point on, we've not looked back. So what Spire is pointing out in the book, and let's get back to the book, is the inequality, is the fact that you can sweep people into a school dormitory and say that you're quarantining them, where there are no sockets, there's no water to wash their hands, there's no distancing. And then you allow those that are more privileged to go and self-isolate in their homes where there's really nobody supervising that. And so I think even with the testing, this is what has happened, that you have the general population that are really at risk. If they were to be sick, there would be no ventilator for them. There would be no private room in a hospital for them. They would probably die in their house. But no, we're not going to test them. We are going to put the test on Nakasero Road, where it costs only $65. Really? I think so government exists and takes taxes so that it can provide safety nets for the majority of the citizens who cannot afford the more privileged services that they can pay for on their own. But when government then leaves that responsibility and they then let the market forces take over, this is what you get. That's how you get, whoever managed to lobby for their hotel to be used as a quarantine center, then was happy that there were all these passengers that were coming in and they were, so they could just name a price, $100, no, $60. Well, $55 for full board. Really? And I think we need to continue to question that and to say, no, we have to find another way. So if there are any learnings from this, let's go back to saying there should be fairness, there should be justice, and that there is never going to be a time when there is equality, but we should not do things that would deliberately enhance inequality, which unfortunately is what has happened with this pandemic. So you see these huge sums of money. I mean, during the first weeks of the pandemics, it was almost like an entertainment. You turn on your television to see which company was going to give, the bigger amount of money and which company was going to donate, and nobody saw where that money went. So now the Auditor General says, oh, 4.5 trillion, and you're like, so was that in the ocean bins? Was that in helping out the little businesses that, businesses have been wiped out. People are going to have serious malnutrition that is going to have an impact for a generation. This is not something that we can gloss over. There was malnutrition in this country. Children were dying. Without a pandemic. Now with a pandemic, with parents locked down, not working, with businesses shut down, and we see government coming out and saying, oh, we are going to now cushion the small businesses, get them to get back on their feet. No, we are not seeing that. And I think that that's what we need to question. And that's why a book like Quarantine, people should read it and not just say, oh, this was an interesting story from Spire, but what does it say about our society? What are our values and what are we doing to make sure that we protect people that have not been protected thus far?
And thank you again, Dr. Olive, for hinting on the issue of equality and equity, because again, I also think at the end of the day, it's the bedrock of human rights and every person's welfare. So thank you for contextualizing that for us and how the government needs to keep the primary steward of these social services. Otherwise, we shall be leaving it to the whims of the market. Is not going to get us to where we ought to be going. I would just I know that we've gone off a little bit, and Dr. Jimmy Spire is also still with us here and would just like to center the discussion back. I know that some people were already asking in the chats. I think people are really excited to have a read of this book, but then also wanting to know what it is, what other forms of presentation you intend to put it in for them for it to appeal to a larger audience. I know that those who do not work easily with this format. So I don't know if there's anything around that, but then also I knew that I'd requested you to come in later to have a tidbit from the book and remind us about this experience that you had. Yes, Dr. Spire.
Yes, thank you, Brian. What exactly do you want me to speak to? Which question?
There was someone who was asking that, do you plan on putting this, I think he said audio-visual? Yes, something of that sort.
Yeah, I think in my response, I indicated in my response to him that, well, I didn't understand exactly what he meant by visual. I think it was visual, not audio-visual. There are cartoons within the book. I don't know whether those would serve the purpose for those who would want to visualize some of the things we went through. And therein, I narrate that at times I felt that
it wasn't enough for me to post on Facebook, text, and all that, that I simply felt I would have to draw, that would give a more vivid picture of how we were feeling, to bring out the emotion, to bring out all the sentiments that could not be reduced to text. So maybe those cartoons could serve to someone who needs a visual component. But if it meant that if I plan to turn the entire book into a visual format, perhaps that idea will come later. At the point, I hadn't thought about it. Maybe at some point I would. There is someone who once commented as I was posting about what we were going through while I was still in quarantine, that this is a movie script that someone should pick up this and turn it into a movie. Maybe this could be the starting point. We could get a movie titled Quarantine. I think there would be so much to tell through such a format. But also briefly going back to the question that was raised earlier, the issue of attribution. Do we credit government for all the things, the positive things that have been talked about, Uganda being internationally flagged as one of the countries that are doing well, the fact that cases seem to be reducing in Uganda of late? I think what we are dealing with there is an issue of causality, which is quite complex in research. That if one is not careful, you can very easily misattribute an effect to a cause that is not. We seem to be saying, and of course, depending on which narrative we want to construct, that if it's government speaking, they say, since B is following A, therefore B is because of A. That since the cases are coming down after we have told people to wear masks, therefore, this credit should be given to us, it's out of our effort. Even when you know clearly that people are not following some of the things they are saying, or even when you see clearly that our hospitals are not doing well. And I think that was the major fear for our panic. So I don't think we should rush to attribute, to say that because we are doing well, therefore, that it's government that is responsible for that effect. In logic, there is what we call the fallacy of appeal to ignorance, where one would say, because we don't know, therefore this is the case. You cannot move from ignorance to conclusion, from not knowing what is responsible for a particular fact to saying that since we don't know what is responsible, I'm picking this particular factor to take the credit. So it could be luck, sheer luck, that maybe Uganda, by some mystical reason, by some factor that we don't know yet, we have been lucky that we have not been affected as much as other countries. Sometimes I've heard outrageous statements that, you see, countries, advanced countries like America are doing so badly, but Uganda has got a few deaths. That means we are doing well. Really? When you look at what's happening, the kind of hospitals that we have, can you say that it's because of the way we have managed, that our health workers, of course I credit those, they are working so much under terrible circumstances, under so much deprivation, but you cannot say, having seen all that, that the reason for the statistics being lower, the death statistics in Uganda, are because government is doing so well. I think that is a rushed conclusion. You can neither say it's not by government nor credit it to government. We simply don't know. That should be the conclusion until we get to know. Thank you.
When I was listening to Dr. Spire talking about the fallacy of appeal to ignorance, I still remember the point of jest that you had in the book, where you talked about an irate, I think he was a Nigerian who used the word preposterous, and you'd never heard of the word. We might as well give credit to the government for having quarantined you to learn the word. But still getting back to the issues, there is something that someone also mentioned. I don't know if it ever occurred to you, because being in this situation, you'd think that you would have sought some sort of concrete redress, at least from government. And the question that one of the participants mentioned was, do you think that there could be, from a human rights perspective, did it ever occur to you that, for what we've gone through, we need to have a suit brought against the government as you were still in that state. Did it occur to you?
Yes, while we were still in quarantine, I thought about that. And there were some lawyers who volunteered. That is a legal brain trust, one of Isaac Semakade. They had volunteered, but it was mostly to push for our release. And after the release, I felt that perhaps we would have to follow up on some of the mistreatment, some of the abuses that we went through while in quarantine, psychological and all else. And it was mostly to make sure that these things do not happen again, because whenever they happen and we let government get away with them, it sort of emboldens them to do the same even to other people. But on further reflection, I felt, especially since at the moment there was so much panic, that it would be too much while government is fidgeting with the pandemic, and on the other hand, there are us, our group, suing them. So I felt that for the sake of wider society, maybe there was more advantage to not suing for the public.
Chair, can I just?
But that's not to say that others should not consider that route.
Chair, can I just say something?
And something brief before I get back to Spire. Yes.
You know, what has mentioned is very important. And this is the approach for me on this discussion. You know, we are having a post-mortem. I can guarantee you several times the doctors wanted to lay down their tools. But some of us, the elders, they are said, look, we can lay down our tools because there are no masks, of course, that's very important, but also because we thought that the country is in need of resources, that was not the time to push for salary increase and that kind of thing. Of course, in retrospect now, as we sit down and take our tea, we look at the 4.1 trillion and how much was eaten, and we're like, oh gosh. Two, we thought of the wider society and said, who is going to suffer in this time of, the pandemic? And we thought that it would be against ourselves, okay, not to go and serve Ugandans. Just pulling out from that string, which Spire was talking about, that for the greater society, some things could not just happen. The Americans, if you look at the American Medical Association, they were like, we have experienced deaths as doctors, so many, by the way, in America, but they will never forget the betrayal they received from their government, but they still continue to serve because that was their obligation. You can imagine if all doctors walked away from ICU and said, this PPE here, there is no this, there is no that, then it would even be worse, because the people in charge of making decisions, unfortunately, maybe do not understand what's going on there. You can see the 10 million which went to MPs, at the beginning, they already were sharing something before even thinking about some of these supplies. And not that the situation has improved. We have just found ourselves coping. This is what I gather from those on the front line. They have, and the disease somehow has disappeared, and we have survived. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ekwaro, for making that short. As we wrap up our discussion, I just want, and for all the panelists now, just be asking for one word, starting with Dr. Olive Kobusinje. In one word, what would you say that reading this book, what is the most dominant emotion that it evoked in you? And this question is going to cut across. Just one word as we wrap up.
I would have to disappoint you. I don't have one word, but as I said at the beginning, it's the humanity. It's seeing how when people are thrown together in such incredible circumstances, what comes through is, maybe it's the Ubuntu. So I'd have to leave it at that.
Okay, and Dr. Ekwaro, if you can manage one word.
Just thank you for supporting Spire to bring out this this very, very important to the health system. You know, we also wanted to write our experience in the doctors. Some of the issues Spire has raised and raised in this meeting were actually talked about 3 years ago, but thanks to COVID, Spire has captured them. But in future, if maybe think about supporting those doctors to write the experience with some of these issues. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Alana.
Sorry, I was muted. First of all, I've just been very distracted laughing at all the comments because it's a lot of nuance, and I wish we had more ways to get you all to speak. I think there's a lot of frustration. I hope the ministry is noting, because what has come through very strongly both in Spire's book and in the chapter we wrote, and also in the comments and the other panelists, is the idea that we must be trying to work for Uganda that works for all, and that in any intervention, you must be thinking about the least placed person. You must be engaging them and just providing information. No one has come onto this chat, for example, and said COVID-19 is not real. Spire at no point in his book did he say this. He even tells you that at the beginning he condemned those who escaped until he saw his plight. Then he thought I should have probably joined them in the beginning. And so Ugandans do want to collectively work together, but we continue to have a system that is excluding the most vulnerable. Dr. Kobusinga talked about this trend towards public-private partnerships towards the poor. I mean, Isa has a whole report on the website around that and how it excludes people, the poor. Dr. Spire talks about, again, poor women in particular and their plight in this and the differential treatment. And someone here just said, I don't see myself taking 200K for testing, yet I haven't cleared rent. This is a no-brainer. Public policy needs to recognize that they should be accessing information, they should be community engagement, and you should be, from a rights-based perspective, think about the most vulnerable. You should be thinking about equity. So I know you asked for one word. I apologize. Discussion. I feel that we need to amplify the comments that were coming.
Okay, Elana, your one word is equity. Your one word is equity.
The risk that I was taking when I asked for that.
Yeah. But I don't want to engage on social media. This discussion seems like it could have gone on for hours. We were concerned that it's a Friday afternoon. We need to wrap it up. But particularly the young people, we do want to hear from you, because Dr. Obuku has talked about the fact that it is going. This is a wave. This is not going to be it. There will be another wave. There will be variants. And we've seen how other countries have grappled. So if we don't fix it now, we are going to have a bigger mess later on. And I hope the government is listening.
Yes, Mirembe, before Spire finally just wraps it up.
I think my word would be nuance, because this morning when Dr. Spire told us about, for example, there was a video that was circulating where the Minister of Health told someone to shut up, and everyone was applauding her for doing that. But then he told us the story behind that, and also the various stories that he tells in the book about the different experiences. I think it's very important to recognize it and acknowledge it and, you know, take it into account. And I think Spire's book does that.
Thank you very much, Mirembe. And back to you, Spire. One of the questions that I wanted to ask you as we finish this is reflecting on what the panelists have all discussed, because again, this goes back to your story. Do you, in summary, think that we've addressed the things that you identified with as you're writing the story, what you thought could go out there as people were discussing the content of the story? Do you think we've done a good job at reflecting on your story?
No, I really think it's already much more than what I anticipated. Usually when you're writing a book, you have what you have in mind, and you try to cater for what you think your readers will think, but you can never be really so accurate in doing that. There are so many perspectives that have come up right from the morning and this discussion, and they send you into thinking, oh, there is also that angle. I did not really emphasize the point of attribution, the point of inequality. I talk about so many inequalities there. But from the discussion, I started feeling, oh, maybe I think I should also have included this. There are some things I left out that I feel were very important, and I should have included them just to throw more light on particular aspects, particular angles of this discussion that have been ignored or that have been deliberately pushed to the periphery. So I'm already happy with where the discussion is going. And I think that after reading the book, it will even be more interesting. A part of the reason for writing this book was to keep with the discussion, to continue the conversation. And I'm happy that the conversation takes even lines of discussion beyond what I imagined. Yeah, that's already a great direction.
Thank you very, very much. And just to add that from my end, I really think that your personality and what you do provides for fertile ground for future discussions that are in this direction. I'm very sure that there will be another sort of production that still gets us together to discuss what happened to Dr. Spire. And I think you shouldn't stop in doing whatever you're doing. It is very bold of you to step up and be doing this. I know that even when you are an inmate, you still had the courage to be posting these things as everything was being was happening, and updating Ugandans on what was going on. And of course, you're running the risk of having been silenced, especially also from within. Anything could have happened. There could have been a narrative that can easily have come out, and it would be easy to believe, since again you had been quarantined as a COVID-19 suspect, or it could have happened. I don't know what could have happened, but for taking that step, we really thank you, and for the opportunity of having all of us to be part of this journey in one way or another. We thank you very much, and I'll also be personally reaching out to everyone that was able to come here for the discussion, especially for the panelists. I cannot thank you enough for how you've enriched this discussion, and may God bless you. That's if we all believe in God. Yeah.
You and there was a burning question that was posted that I think was posted to the panelists on a very topical issue around vaccines. And what about them sort of being, outsourced the private sector, and also whether they are safe, and how they think about the government and vaccines in light of what was discussed. I'm trying to find the person's name, but I just didn't want us to miss that even as we wrap up, just because I think we have an obligation to speak about vaccines as a public health issue, because it's the quickest way to stop the pandemic as well. I don't know if I could probably speak as the person who just saw the question, but I think it's actually most directed at Dr. Kobusingye and Dr. Kwaru, but is to underscore that Dr. Kobusingye did talk about the inequities that come out when the government cedes control to the private sector and removes itself from that. And we have been talking a lot about who falls through the cracks and where things go wrong. So this issue of vaccines as well, the government needs to retain central stewardship over it, and they have to do it again in a way that is transparent, in a way where they communicate and engage with communities, in a way where vaccines are free to everyone who needs them, and in a way where there is no perception that those who have means or are more important are jumping the queue. So again, it falls very much with the conversations we've had here, but I just wanted to give you a response, and Isa has done quite a bit of work on this. Please follow our social media handles. But I want to turn it over to my panelists, because it was a question that came up that we forgot to address, and I forgot to mention it earlier because I was very amused by all the comments on the chat.
There is a lot that could possibly be discussed, and I think we all agree, and we can have the entire evening here. But also, as Alana said, I think some of these discussions, if you also follow closely on, for Isa, you'll be able to catch up with what we have to say about the vaccine. It's really a lot, and I hope that we can try to stay in each other's spaces to know and get wind of everything that is happening. Again, thank you very much. We are 8 minutes past the time we're intended to end. and we apologize for that, but I hope it was worth the violation of your time. So just to say that thank you again for coming, and may God bless you. Have a wonderful evening and a good weekend ahead of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations again, Spire.
Thank you, Dr. Oliver. Nice to finally meet you. Meet you.
Indeed, a pleasure.
You can all just say bye-bye as we get off.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kwaro, and for the entire audience. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And to our moderator.
Indeed.